And it's really an implausible tale about a world that runs on probabilities, a family that rediscovers the magic of proximity, the gravity of love, and perhaps the very reason for faith and hope in spite of this dark age of terror. Prologue. The war had gone on a long time, longer than anyone had wanted, certainly longer than little Noir Rondell had wanted it to. She was 10. The war had started when she was 7. Her mother had passed on at the beginning of the war when the terrorist bombing began, and her father had been taken by it as well, or rather called to action. And although everyone said he wasn't dead, as far as she was concerned, he might as well have been. She hadn't seen him since the war began, and for some reason they called sensitive operations. She hadn't heard from him in over a year, not even letters. They kept telling her that when the war was over, she'd understand why things had to have been the way they were. But to a little girl of 10, a whole year is a very long time, and she missed him terribly. Then again, nothing made much sense since the war had begun. Going on 3 years now, she had been shuffled from one school to another, and then everything changed. The military boarding school she'd been attending the longest had become a target for terrorists. Now she was being sent to the country to live with her Grandma Brandy and Grandpa Brick for the rest of the year. It had been a very welcome change, actually. She hadn't seen her grandparents since the war began, and since they were her last 2 living relatives left, staying with members of her own family had become a truly exciting prospect for her. As the bus pulled into the station, she was eagerly looking for her grandma, whose colorful dress and proper appearance was almost at odds with the fashion of the time, making her very easy to pick out of a crowd. Getting off the bus, Noir dropped her bags and leapt into her Grandma Brandy's arms. After 3 years spent with strangers, she was finally home again. Chapter 1, in which a bookcase is rediscovered. Part 1, a new venue. It was a beautiful sunny day. The estate was unchanged. In fact, it was almost a bit spooky. It was as if the whole place had resisted time effortlessly over the years. Butterfly bushes still spread out all across the front yard. A beautiful tall bird bath still stood proudly by the red brick walkway that spiraled from the front porch to the back. The Liberty Bell that was suspended from 2 wooden posts in the ground was still draped with lavender. In glee, Noir rang it loudly. Grandma Brandy smiled a big, broad smile. What a wonderful day. Her only grandchild had come home. Her only grandchild was safe. "Go take your things up to the guest room. That's where you'll be staying," she said softly. Noir walked up the long, circular staircase to the 4th floor, edging around the banister to the second door on the left, right in front of the door to the attic. Grandma Brandy had meticulously prepared the guest room for Noir, cleaned from ceiling to floor with some cleanser that made her sneeze twice. The room was immaculate and detailed. Here a red cinnamon candle, there a lamp with cattails, on the wall a painting of a cherubim shooting an arrow, and a vase with blue flowers adjusted perfectly on the nightstand by the bed. Every inch of the room bore the touch of Grandma Brandy, except the bookcase. From the floor to the very top of the ceiling, the bookcase dominated the guest room in the nicest possible way, like a silent monolith. Noir sat quietly with her bags on the bed and for a moment gazed across a landscape of books. It was more like being in church than being in a library. Mark Twain, Flash Gordon, Carl Sagan, Mandrake the Magician, the Odyssey, the Iliad, Lewis Carroll, Tarzan, books on aliens, Sherlock Holmes, Lord of the Rings, Tom Swift and his rocket ship, and on and on. And Noir took a deep breath and turned back to the doorway. Grandma Brandy had been standing there watching her. She had a large key in her hand, which she handed gently to Noir. "It wasn't always a guest room," she smiled, somehow anticipating Noir's next question. "Your father would sleep here when he came home from college. In fact, he stayed here 3 years ago, before he went off to war." She straightened up a tilt on one of the lampshades. Noir caressed the key in one hand while she chatted with Grandma Brandy. They walked downstairs and then did a tour of the property until just before sunset, and right after dinner, she excused herself early, saying she wanted to get to bed, and went back upstairs. It had been a long journey. While she noticed the door to the bedroom was ajar, she figured that Grandma Brandy had forgotten something. Then she realized that Grandma Brandy had been with her the entire time. As she came into the room, she noticed several books had fallen from one of the shelves. "How very odd," she whispered to herself as she knelt on the floor. Picking them up carefully, she put each one back on the shelf. Not, in fact, an easy chore. The bookcase was packed, but with loving care for each of her father's and grandfather's books, she found the proper home for each and every one of them. H.G. Wells, The Shape of Things to Come. Uninvited Visitors by Sanderson, 2010 by Arthur C. Clarke, The Voices of Heaven by Frederick Pohl, and then a book she had never seen before. It was tall and slender, made of black leather, with a 5-pointed star, a sun and a moon, emblazoned and raised, beautifully engraved in white, silver, and gold. And it was locked, with a curious strap and a bronze fitting that would not come undone. There was no keyhole, and it looked brand new. After a few minutes of racking her brain, she again realized how tired she was. "Very curious," she said aloud, and put it on the nightstand by the bed. "Tomorrow," she thought determinedly, "I'll figure out how to open it." Part 2. Grandma Brandy Gets Real Handy. Noir woke up with the tangible excitement of a person waking up to a mission. The mission? Open the book. Noir enjoyed the challenge, but where was it? She'd put it on the bedstand closest to the bookcase, and there it was on the floor. She must have knocked it off in her sleep. Picking it up, she began to look it over. Nothing had changed. She hadn't imagined it at all. The book was locked. The clasp and seal had no keyhole. The black leather smelled brand new. The sun, moon, and 5-pointed stars glinted in the morning light, and there was not a hint or a clue as to its contents, or how to open it. So she futzed with it before her shower, and then after her shower. She pried at it before her lunch, and then after lunch. She fiddled, faddled, peeled, and battled with the book until she was totally exasperated. This was more than a challenge. She had seriously manhandled it, just short of destroying the thing, and still no luck. Finally, just before dinner, Noir made the most difficult decision a child can make when they have single-handedly discovered a magical mystery, as it had been in private. Take it to an adult. After a moment's introduction at the dinner table, Grandma Brandy's surprise showed that she was clearly on the up and up, and as much in the dark as Noir had been. She'd never seen the book before. She didn't know where it had come from. But she immediately figured out something so obvious that Noir felt a bit embarrassed. The sun, the moon, and the 5-pointed star were like big buttons. Remarking how beautiful they were, Grandma Brandy pushed down on one while the book was sitting on the kitchen table, perhaps harder than she had meant to, for it depressed into a slight recess, making a cute but barely audible click. And a note. Music. Noir and her grandmother exchanged smiles excitedly. This was only the first discovery. A cascade of discoveries followed. First, and most naturally, they found out that each button produced a different note, and then that holding down 2 buttons at the same time produced yet an entirely different note altogether. And finally, they discovered that holding all 3 buttons repeated all the notes that they had made previously in the order that they had made them, followed with a delightful and light-hearted crescendo, apparently resetting the memory of the order in which all the notes had previously been created. Having exhausted this startling variety of discoveries, Noir uttered the word "wow" softly to herself and set the book back on the table. Grandma Brandy agreed wholeheartedly and warmed up Noir's cold dinner plate. "All right, girl child, it's time to eat. This is the 2nd time I've popped your dinner in the microwave." Noir obliged, gobbling her food like a hungry little wolf cub, hardly taking her eyes and her left hand from the book. When she was done eating, she looked up thoughtfully and asked Grandma Brandy a question she'd been meaning to ask since the day before. "Grandma Brandy, where's Pop Brick?" "Your grandfather's on a business trip. He'll be back sometime next week." "What kind of business?" "Oh, you know, doing things for the center." That was all Noir would get out of her grandmother, and she knew it. Grandpa Brick was nearly as mysterious a figure as her father. 5 years ago, he'd started a research center for advanced vehicles. And the government apparently liked his work so much that it had bought the place when the war had started and kept him on to run things for him. His work often took him to exotic places for extended stays. "Do you think he'd know how to open it?" "I don't know, honey." Grandma Brandy was drying dishes. "I can send him an email tonight if you want." "Oh, yes, please." She waited a moment, then asked, "Do you think this is his book?" "No, honey, I don't think so. Like I told you, I've never seen it before today." Noir trotted back upstairs with a book and a cup of hot chocolate. Curiouser and curiouser, she thought, but tomorrow was another day. Part 3, use a book to open a book. A musical book with no keyhole. Baffling, thought Noir. Beautiful, brilliant, but baffling all the same. Clearly the music it produced had to be the key to opening the darn thing. After having brushed her teeth and put on her nightgown, she got into bed, tucked herself in, and realized sleep would not come easily. She tossed and turned for about 10 minutes, and then she turned the light back on, grabbed the book, and sat there staring at it. Within seconds, the guest room was filled with simple tunes. Luckily, her Grandma Brandy was sleeping in the bedroom 2 floors below her and would not be disturbed by her musical expedition. It can only make 6 notes, she thought to herself. How complicated could it get? But then, after about a dozen attempts, one of which sounded eerily like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or was it When You Wished Upon a Star, an unassailable doubt came to sit next to her in the bed. The key refrain could be 100 notes long or more. How important were the secrets contained in this book? And what if there were no secrets inside at all? What if it was totally blank and this was nothing more than a cruel joke? She went back to making music. At some point, she realized that the 6 notes were not contiguous. In other words, they were not a whole section of an octave. This was interesting to note, but it really didn't help her get any closer to her goal. She put the book back in the bedstand, and just as she was about to turn out the light and give the Sandman a second chance, something made her look back at the bookcase. Unsure as to the why and wherefore, she got up out of the bed, stood in front of the bookcase, and said aloud, "All right, I need a clue." And not really knowing what would happen or what to expect, she closed her eyes and pulled the book from the shelf. It was by Clifford Simak, Strangers in the Universe. She opened it randomly and read a few lines from the top of page 140. Quote, unquote, missionary, trader, diplomat, or just a mere machine and nothing more. Spy, adventurer, investigator, surveyor, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. And why of all places had it landed here, in this forsaken farmland, in this pasture on his farm, and its purpose, unquote. It was an interesting story that almost sucked her into it, something about an alien invasion, but nothing helpful for opening a music-making book. After all, what had she been expecting? Magic, she realized, the kind of magic her father had taught her. When she was little, she remembered, he must have told her 100 times, when you need an answer from the universe, go to a bookcase and randomly pull a book from the shelf and then open the book randomly. Just like it was yesterday, she could hear his voice in her head. Try it. You'll be astonished at how relevant the passage you're reading is to the problem at hand. This is a divination technique as old as ancient Sumer. But it hadn't worked. She began to put the book back in the shelf when she started to knock another book cleanly off, a thick volume called 1,000 Years a Minute, Adventures in the Unknown by someone named Carl Claudy, tumbled to the floor, spilling a bookmark at her feet. The bookmark had 2 golden crowns on it, and in very precise lettering were 2 simple sentences. Don't give up. Look in the attic. She was stupefied. It was her father's handwriting. Thank you.